World War II saw armored combat used more efficiently and brutally than in any previous conflict. War of attrition tactics, like those of World War I, now shared space on the theaters of operations, with rapid and decisive tank assaults against strategic points of enemy defenses. Entire countries would fall in a matter of days. In the Pacific, armored vehicles proved to be more difficult to use, since the battles were fought on small islands full of geographical obstacles, like rivers and unstable terrain. Therefore, the tanks used there needed to be smaller and lighter, as well as capable of being transported by boats. In this regard, the American M4 Sherman proved to be a versatile and resilient platform. At the beginning of the conflict, the Shermans were equipped with short 75mm cannons, which were sufficient to deal with Japanese armored vehicles like the Type 97 Shiha and light fortifications. The Japanese, on the other hand, developed armored vehicles like the Type 3 Shinu with more powerful armaments, but they were not produced in significant numbers to alter the balance of power on the battlefield. In India, the situation was completely different. When the Allies landed in Normandy and subsequently came into contact with the German territorial defense armored troops, the conventional Sherman proved to be outdated. The long 75mm guns of the Panther and the 88mm guns of the Tiger could easily pierce the armor of a myriad of tanks from the invading forces, which called for a quick response. The British modified some of their Sherman tanks received through Lend-Lease to use the more powerful 76.2mm quick-firing 17-pounder gun, which was previously used as a mobile anti-tank weapon, but was adapted to be mounted in the Sherman's turret. Just like the Americans, they began using the long 76mm 1L55 gun. These weapons could, with a more accurate shot, disable German armored vehicles, but another response also came in the form of increased armor. In addition to also receiving the upgraded armament, the more heavily armored versions of the Sherman, known as Jumbo, began to be seen more frequently on the battlefield. In addition to having redesigned frontal armor, they also featured a different type of construction and metal treatment, making their protection more effective. The strategy of lighter armored vehicles with more powerful armament to be used as tank destroyers was also a measure that worked for a short period. Some of the most memorable Allied vehicles that carried out this mission were the M10 Wolverine and the M18 Hellcat. But the continuation of the clashes showed that another armored vehicle was needed, one that could go head-to-head with possible enemy offensives. The lessons learned from the battles up to that point indicated a potential use for heavier tanks in Europe. In addition to having seen the results of the arrival of the Joseph Stalin series tanks on the Eastern Front, the United States had already flirted with the idea of heavier armored vehicles for its troops. Among the heavier tank projects were those of the T-20 series. Back in 1942, the United States Army Ordnance Department received a request to develop a new tank called the T-20. This new armored vehicle was supposed to serve as an upgrade for the Sherman, but it would be used as a test platform for new technologies to be employed by tanks. Thus, a design with the same dimensions as the Sherman appeared in order to maintain the possibility of transport using the means available at that time. Using technology and some elements common to the M4, it was decided to build 3 prototypes: the T-20, the T-20E1, and the T-20E2. They had turrets and mechanisms that could be swapped out for testing. All of these vehicles, from the beginning, had been conceived with the idea of being just test platforms for new concepts. The T-20S were initially going to receive a more powerful V12 engine, but it was replaced by a simpler V8. just like the use of a horizontal volute spring suspension, which was more durable than the one on the M4, an improved and longer version of the 75mm gun, and thicker frontal armor on the chassis. One of the T-20 prototypes tested the Torchmatic automatic transmission, which would later be used in the M18 Hellcat. This type of transmission made operating the tank much easier, and on a light and agile platform like the M18, it proved to be perfect. But in 1943, during the T-20 test, it still wasn't viable for use in a heavier tank. The T-20E3 even tested a different type of suspension, already known at the time and used by the Germans on the Panther, the torsion bar suspension. This mechanism, made up of several metal bars connected by a complex system underneath the tank, evenly distributed the shocks from movement over rough terrain throughout the system that moved and supported the armored vehicle. Thus, when at high speeds or on rough terrain, the tank would sway evenly as a whole, causing less stress on the crew and on the other more fragile parts of the vehicle. The problem with this type of mechanism is that, since it is located in the innermost and lowest part of the tank, in case any of the components needed repair, it was basically necessary to disassemble the entire vehicle, resulting in low operational availability unless it was designed with maintenance in mind. The successors to the T-20 were the T-22 and the T-23. The Torque-O-Matic transmission was still not fully operational. In the heavy models then, the T-22 used the same transmission as the regular M4S, as well as the guns and engine of the T-20S. One example of the T-22 was modified to use an automatic loader, which would mechanically perform the work of one of the crew members, the loader, thus reducing the number of soldiers inside. But the urgent need for a replacement for the M4 would only arise in 1944. A year later then, the project moved on to other goals. That's when the T-23 appeared with almost all the same features as the T-22, except for the transmission. This tank model would have 6 prototypes produced and 250 production units manufactured, but these tanks would never see combat on any foreign front. All the T-23S served only on American soil for training and local defense, because there was not full confidence in their transmission mechanisms. Some T-23 units tested different models of electric transmission, which was still rarely used by the Americans, and was more popular with Axis countries, such as Germany. Besides allowing for greater torque on slopes, the electric transmission had very high acceleration, much higher than other types, making the tank more agile. That's when reports from the battles in Normandy started to arrive, and based on the knowledge acquired from other tanks in the T-20 family, the T-25 tank was developed. This tank would have a larger turret to house a powerful 90mm cannon, ideal for going head-to-head against the heavy tanks that were starting to appear in Europe. And it had many of the features of heavier armor in some components. But during the tests with the prototypes, another model from the T-20 series was chosen for production, the T-26, basically the same vehicle as the T-25, but with reinforced armor on the chassis. With 109mm of steel on the upper front and turret sections, while the rest of the tank had armor ranging from 50 to 75mm, and the turret had 76mm of armor on the sides. The T-26E3, later renamed to M26 Pershing, had a crew of 5, a driver, a commander, a gunner, a loader, and a radio operator, who also operated a 7.62mm machine gun installed at the front of the tank's chassis. In addition to operating the efficient 90mm cannon, the gunner also had access to another 7.62mm coaxial machine gun. and the commander could use a .50 caliber heavy machine gun installed on top of the turret, whether against low-flying aircraft or lightly protected enemy positions. The tank's weight was about 40 tons, so it was considered a heavy tank by the standards of the time. Its engine was a lighter but equally powerful version of the Ford GAF, an 8-cylinder machine with 500 horsepower. This was the standard engine used in versions of the Sherman. This made the M26 perform below ideal for a tank of its size. Its suspension was the torsion bar type, with the Torque-O-Matic automatic electric transmission, the same used by the M18. At the rear of the tank, there was a box with a telephone that allowed the infantry around the armored vehicle to have direct contact with the crew. In addition, a semi-automatic fire suppression system was also included in the vehicle. The driver had a periscope that could rotate as well as control over the fire suppression system. Its instrument panel had 5 circuit breakers, a lever to select the fuel tank, 1 fuel to be used, control for the engine's electric starter, a tachometer, individual heating differential settings, a button for fuel cutoff, activation of the panel lights, main lights, speedometer, and indicators for oil pressure and engine temperature. A total of 250 units were ordered at first, but by the end of the war, about units of the armored vehicle would be produced. There was a lot of resistance to incorporating the M26 into the front lines, both for strategic and political reasons. Field units preferred to adopt improved versions of the Sherman, rather than adopting a new tank, especially from the 1st and 2nd American Armored Divisions. Another important factor was the opinion of General Leslie McNair, commander of the ground forces, who had developed the tank destroyer tactics. He also believed that the M4 variants could handle the tanks present on the battlefield, and that the supply lines should be prioritized for provisions instead of new, untested vehicles. At that point in the war, the German troops were defending their territory with all their strength and putting a lot of pressure on the invading Allied forces, which reinforced General McNair's view. The result of the Battle of the Ardennes, with heavy losses for both the German and American sides, along with the death of General McNair in an accident in Normandy, opened the doors for testing the M26, Pershing, in the field. Initially, the first Pershings would be sent to North Africa to be tested in desert terrain, but repeated refusals from the German commanders in the region, who said they didn't have ideal conditions for an untested tank, led to a delay in the tank's debut in the war. Then, the technical mission Zebra was put into action under the command of Major General Gladian Barnes. In the beginning, veteran M4 Sherman crews were adapted to the new armored vehicle, as well as the evaluation of its performance on the battlefield. They were transported to Europe through the port of Antwerp. The mission officers met with the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, General Dwight Eisenhower, in Paris. It was decided that the M26 should be put into action as soon as possible. Now, the Third Reich would feel the power of heavy American steel firsthand, or at least that was the idea. Few M26 would see combat in World War II, but one of those battles would go down in history, especially because it was entirely filmed and took place near the Cologne Cathedral. With the retreat of German forces, American troops rushed to occupy the strategic and symbolic city of the Axis domain. During an incursion through its streets, 2 M4 tanks were advancing when they came across a tank destroyer, apparently immobile. As they approached, however, the tank began to move, revealing it was a trap. The Panzer quickly fired and destroyed the first armored vehicle, with the commander having to crawl through the burning tank to escape. But he died shortly after because one of his legs had been torn off by the impact of the enemy shell. The other tank quickly retreated and provided support for the crew of the first vehicle. A few streets down, the crew of an M26 heard the sounds of combat and soon approached the area where the enemy Panzer might be. After analyzing the situation and realizing that the Panther had its gun facing another direction, they decided to perform a flanking maneuver, trying to hit the right side of the enemy tank. Picking up speed, the M26 entered the street, with its turret turned to take out the Panther, when the worst sight in the world materialized. The Panther had turned its turret, and now the M26's gunner was staring at the huge 75mm cannon pointed in his direction, at a distance where many guns would be effective against the M26's armor. Meanwhile, inside the Panther, the German commander hadn't recognized the enemy tank and initially thought it was some kind of German combat vehicle, so he ordered not to fire. When he realized his mistake, it was already too late. The panic inside the Pershing was enormous, but the gunner's training made him hit his first shot on the Panther, destroying the engine compartment. The impact was enough to make the German crew flee, but even so, a second shot was fired at the turret, and a third one right after, which caused part of the ammunition inside to detonate. Several shots were fired even after the crew began to evacuate the vehicle. It wasn't out of cruelty, because anyone still inside could pull the trigger and destroy the American tank that was still in their sights. The first M26 were considered very valuable, and several experiments were carried out to protect them as much as possible from enemy fire, resulting in a special version of the tank, designated T-26E4. The T-26E4 featured a different armament, the high-velocity T-15E1 gun. This weapon was initially tested in the United States and had a longer barrel than the other guns, at 90mm, as well as being heavier overall. Because of this weight, a set of springs was installed on the top of the armored vehicle to help lift the enormous load. The guns and a counterweight was added to the back of the turret. At first, it was observed that there was no space inside the tank to carry a decent amount of ammunition, since the T-15E1 gun used different ammunition than usual, which was larger and heavier. Thus, an adaptation was made in the subsequent units of the T-26E4, and the ammunition started to come in two parts, with the projectile and the propellant separated. As in other tanks with larger caliber guns, like the Soviet Iosif Stalin II, the first example of the T-26E4 nicknamed Super Pershing, still with its single-piece ammunition, was sent to Europe and assigned to the 3rd Armored Division. Upon arrival, the head of the unit's repair section did not want the only example of the tank in Europe to be lost, and because of that, he began reinforcing the vehicle's armor. Together with his team, he started by welding two huge 38mm metal plates onto the tank's frontal armor, hoping that this improvement would increase the chance of ricochets. It was known that the shells from the Panther and Tiger could penetrate some parts of the Pershing's turret, and that's when the almost insane homemade armor upgrade of the Super Pershing became completely insane. Taking the hull of a Panther tank that had been knocked out, the Americans tore off the 80mm frontal armor from the vehicle and adapted it, adding small holes for the gun and coaxial armaments of the T-26E4. They installed it on the turret as a kind of armored battle death mask for the Super Pershing. In addition, two more parts from the Panther would be added to the sides of the turret for extra armor. All of this caused the tank's gun to tilt downward due to the weight. Therefore, another piece of metal was added as a counterweight to keep the gun level. All these reinforcements would add more than 5 tons to the already heavy Super Pershing. The tank would take part in combat on 2 occasions, destroying an unknown armored vehicle in one of them, and in the other, supposedly destroying a Tiger II, or King Tiger. According to the crew, the 2 armored vehicles engaged in combat when a shot from the Tiger II ricocheted off the Super Pershing, which returned a precise shot to the lower part of the armor, blowing up the enemy. However, the German military unit operating the Tiger IIs and located closest was actually dozens of kilometers away. Therefore, there is debate as to whether it was actually another tank that was destroyed by the Super Pershing. The T-26E4 only didn't see more combat due to logistical problems that prevented it from taking part in more attacks. First, its special 90mm ammunition was sent to the wrong unit. Then, special optical sights calibrated for the T-15E1 cannon remained in the United States, so sights for the conventional 90mm M3 cannon were installed instead. This made it necessary to conduct field firing tests to recalibrate it. But most importantly, all the additional weight added to the front of the tank put even more pressure on the Pershing's engine, which was already struggling to move the vehicle at high speeds, making the Super Pershing much less agile and slower than the other units, which affected its strategic use. Only one example of the Super Pershing, with its cannibalized armor, existed, and it was the only one of its model to see combat in Europe. Testing with other versions of the Super Pershing would continue in the United States, with only a few dozen tanks produced instead of the 1,000 units initially required. But some technological advances from the project would be shared with future prototypes. The last record of the only Super Pershing to fight in Europe shows the vehicle in a junkyard in Kassel, Germany, from where it probably went on to be scrapped. The first loss of a Pershing occurred on February 26, 1945, on a rainy night, when a group of Allied armored vehicles launched an attack. In the village of Elsdorf, Germany, the tank column included Pershing number 38, nicknamed Fireball. Elsdorf was mostly deserted, but there were roadblocks with tree trunks. There were also some anti-tank guns and German troops hidden at certain points in the city to confront the invaders. When it reached the entrance of the village, Fireball stopped in front of a barrier made of logs. The nearby German troops quickly fled, and this encouraged the crew of the Pershing to try to go over the obstacle. While they were trying to get over it, the enemy made their move. A fearsome force of 3 Tiger tanks entered from the west flank of the town. 2 of the vehicles took up separate positions along the streets, while the third continued to the end of the street. As the M26 was passing the obstacle, a Sherman parked behind it, waiting for its turn to go through. But then, a gigantic flame burst out behind Fireball, with the Sherman exploding as a result of being hit by an enemy projectile. The light from the explosion was so bright that it highlighted the silhouette of the Pershing right in front of the Tiger, which was approaching. At close range, it fired 3 quick and deadly shots at the Fireball, killing 2 of its crew members and putting the tank out of action. Shortly after, however, the Tiger tried to retreat from its position and ended up stuck in a pile of rubble. And its crew had to abandon the armored vehicle shortly afterward. The M26 had a small role at the end of World War II, but it was enough to understand the positive and negative points of the initial versions of the model. The first 20 units were the ones that saw actual combat in Europe, with the others arriving later and becoming a force of 200 tanks in operational service, until the day of victory against Germany. Even though only limited combat experience had been gained, it was enough to put into perspective a new idea of using heavier tanks on the front line. Among the points that required more attention on the MB-26 was its engine, which was constantly working at its limit, since the tank was much heavier than the Sherman. Its suspension needed reliability improvements, and its range was below average due to the excessive stress on the engine. Some units of the Pershing were even sent to the Pacific Front, where they came very close to seeing combat in Okinawa. But by the time they landed on the island, the Japanese resistance had already been destroyed. 5 years later, however, the MB-26 would return to the east to test their firepower in the heat of war. With the end of World War II, something interesting happened with the American armored forces. What is being studied is whether there was actually a tank gap, that is, a gap in tanks in the United States Army. In the 5 years following the victory against the Axis, the development of new examples and models of tanks was halted. In 1949, there were no tanks in any production line in the United States, not even any being designed to replace the current ones, which were from the last war's design. American investment focused on strengthening its air force and nuclear weapons, which they believed would be enough to deter any possible conflicts. Was the danger demonstrated by the advancement of armored vehicle technology a real threat to Western countries? And it's still debatable, just like its real causes. Whether it was the strategy employed or some intentional mistake by the administration, which sought to stir up panic among congressmen and the population in order to acquire more resources. But the fact is that on June 25, 1951, of the most forgotten conflicts in popular history would begin, the Korean War. After the border conflicts, political and diplomatic disagreements, as well as internal uprisings in South Korea, North Korea launched an offensive with the goal of taking the territories they considered rightfully theirs, that is, the rest of the Korean peninsula. The political roots of such an act range from the desire of China and the Soviet Union to have their borders clear, to having a country allied with the capitalist bloc. Even differences in the forms of government of both Koreas, which also had completely opposite economic models. But the fact is that North Korea came very close to achieving its goals at the beginning of the war, due to a factor that proved almost deadly for the South Korean military forces: their total lack of armored vehicles. The Soviet Union and China sent hundreds of T-34-85 tanks to the North Korean army. Remnants from a World War II setting, these armored vehicles were no longer the ones hastily produced during the German invasion. These were tanks that had been upgraded with some of their problems observed in combat, corrected and refined based on wartime experience. More advanced tanks like the T-44 and T-54 were already being operated in other countries, but the T-34-85S were still available in large numbers, and their powerful 85mm cannons could penetrate a range of vehicles operated by capitalist bloc countries, which is why they were transferred to assist in the North Korean offensive. And it was precisely by using these armored vehicles that the North Korean armed forces achieved immense success in their advance. The South lacked significant armored forces, with only a few outdated pre-war Japanese Type 95S and some variants of the Sherman tank. In addition, their soldiers were not properly trained in large-scale warfare involving armored vehicles. Since the focus of geopolitical tensions was Europe, the United States kept its main forces on that continent. So, when they went to assist the South Korean forces in combat, only M24 Chaffee Light reconnaissance tanks, which were available at bases in Japan, were transferred at first. But even so, the armament and armor of these tanks were not enough to go head-to-head with the T-34-85S, which crushed any resistance they encountered along their way. The North Korean advance was so intense that the South Korean armed forces and the international United Nations forces assisting in the fighting were trapped in a small region surrounded by the Sea to the south, forming a perimeter around the city of Busan. At this point in the fighting, the North Korean side was facing the challenges of occupying enemy territory and having extremely stretched and fragile supply lines. And the South Korean side was struggling with fatigue and low troop morale due to numerous defeats. The need for capable armored vehicles was so urgent that the first M26s to arrive in Korea were found in a United States Army warehouse in Japan on June 28, 1950. All of them had mechanical and engine problems, but they were quickly restored with temporary measures within a month and sent into combat. As soon as they arrived in Korea on July 16, they were transferred by train to the city of Jinjo, where they were supposed to help hold back the attacking North Korean troops. When they got off at the Department of Railway Transport, they waited nearby for new belts for their engine cooling system. The belts made in Japan were too short and caused the engine to constantly overheat, so they needed to fix this problem urgently. On July 31, the 6th Division of the North Korean Army tried to invade the city, and the M26 assisted in the defense. A few days later, war correspondent William Moore from the Associated Press noticed a group of soldiers moving up along the railroad that led into the city, and he immediately raised the alarm. Lieutenant Fowler, who was leading the 3 Pershings, went to check out the strange movement. They identified the soldiers as North Koreans and opened fire with their .30 and .50 machine guns, tearing apart the enemy platoon that was out in the open. But Lieutenant Fowler himself would be wounded in the exchange of gunfire while operating one of the machine guns. Next, they were going to head toward the city of Masan, but on the way they found the only access route, a bridge on the road, had been destroyed. So the crews of the Pershings abandoned their vehicles and finished the journey on foot. But the desperate need for more capable armored vehicles was not over yet. They urgently needed more tanks. Even the M26, which were on static display at Fort Knox, Kentucky, were quickly made operational and sent to Korea. And it was precisely because of this rushed maintenance that the first M26 in Korea constantly had mechanical problems. Since the Americans had stopped tank production 5 years earlier, they would have to fight with whatever was available at the time. On August 17, 1950, the Pershing would begin to show its real combat capabilities. During the afternoon, a group of 4 M26 Pershings, led by Lieutenant Granville George Sweet, nicknamed Granville George by his colleagues, began stocking their vehicles with ammunition and fuel to prepare for possible engagements. His platoon had already been involved in the defense of the Busan perimeter before, but they had not yet come into contact with enemy tanks. And then, the quiet afternoon changed with the arrival of a message over the flash purple radio. That code warned of approaching enemy armored vehicles. It was time to act. Moving quickly to his armored vehicle, Sweet alerted everyone that they were heading into confrontation. The crews quickly finished their tasks and, in their desperation to get into combat, even spilled fuel while putting the last cans into the armored vehicle's tanks, a fact that would prove extremely relevant. Later at the front, a group of Marines began to take positions on the high ground of the hills around the road that led into the area, exactly where 4 T-34-85S were advancing, along with infantry support right behind them. As soon as they noticed the enemy's presence, the two groups began exchanging fire, with automatic weapon rounds flying in all directions. Along with the occasional shot from the T-34SE cannons, which aimed to force the riflemen out of their positions. In response to this, bazooka teams fired at the North Korean armored vehicles. They didn't penetrate the armor, but they set the external fuel tanks on fire, leaving the top part of the engine of some of them in flames, but still able to move. Nearby, the 4 M26 were approaching. They could already hear the sounds of combat when they came across 2 supply trucks parked on the road, forming a kind of barricade. One of the Pershing commanders, Sergeant Fullerton, then got out of his tank, got into the vehicles, and moved them off the road, making room for the tanks to pass. Moments later, Lieutenant Sweet realized that his cannon was having elevation problems, so he ordered Fullerton to take command of the battle. And that's when Sweet received the message that enemy tanks were heading his way, so he ordered the armored vehicles in his platoon to form a defensive line. On the road, near a curve, with a rise blocking the view of anyone approaching, the first T-34 appeared. Without wasting any time, Fullerton alerted the crew to the enemy presence and ordered them to fire. The armor-piercing round tore through the front of the tank's turret, passed through the inside, and exited out the back, hitting the side of the mountain. But even with such an impact, the North Korean tank kept advancing toward them. Another shot in the same area, and the projectile followed the same path, once again hitting the mountain right behind, making the Marines position there, anxious that they might be getting flanked. But even this second attack wasn't enough to stop the T-34. Only a third shot, which hit the T-34E's ammunition storage, caused jets of flames to start coming out of the holes made by the M26's hits, signaling that, finally, the enemy had been neutralized. But there was no time to celebrate, because soon the other T-34 appeared and started aiming its cannon in their direction. 2 of them fired almost simultaneously at the new enemy. One of the hits on the T-34 was so strong that it made the turret of the North Korean armored vehicle start spinning like a child's toy. The gunner, who was also located in the turret, fired while it was spinning wildly. Probably stunned by the sudden movement, the T-34 would take 2 more shots and start to catch fire. But it hadn't given up yet. Resembling a walking dead, the tank, burning and slowly falling apart, began to turn its turret toward the Americans, now using explosive ammunition to annihilate the crew and destroy fragile components. The M26 needed 4 more shots to finally silence the second enemy for good. But this still wasn't the end of the battle. Over the radio, the other Pershings warned Fullerton that his tank was starting to catch fire from the shot of the Pershing's 90mm cannon. Small sparks started the fire in the rear of the tank, which was soaked with fuel due to the rush during refueling. But before they could even understand what was happening and get out to put out the flames, a huge impact shook Sergeant Fullerton's tank. Another T-34 appeared on the road, firing again and hitting the armor of the M26, resulting in another ricochet. The M26 fired back, shooting more rounds from their cannons. The Marines who were on the hill witnessed a surreal battle. Besides the clash between the 2 types of armored vehicles, the fire on the M26 was intermittent. This happened because the cannon shot would put out the fire, and the next shot would create sparks that reignited the flames, in a cycle that repeated several times. The repeated volleys of fire soon destroyed the third T-34, and the last tank in the formation decided to retreat, but was quickly destroyed by a bazooka shot from the Marines on the mountain. As a result of his actions that day, Sergeant Cecil Fullerton received the Bronze Star for his outstanding performance. The myth of the invincibility of Soviet tanks in Korea had been broken. As the conflict unfolded, the South Korean side began to turn the tide and push the communists back to the north. The official end of the war never happened, with the two Koreas technically still in a state of war to this day. The border demarcated at the end of the conflict was the 38th parallel north, which today is one of the most militarized regions on the planet. Reports of enemy tank kills by the Americans in Korea indicate that about 50% of T-34S were destroyed by various models. Of the M4 Sherman, with the M26 of all types being responsible for the other half. But the Pershings had a higher survival rate and greater resilience to enemy fire than the M4S, since the M26 had been produced with the same engine set as the Sherman. Even during World War II, it had been found that the armored vehicle lacked sufficient mobility. And with that in mind, along with the fact that now the battlefield was in mountainous regions and the very rugged areas of the Korean peninsula, an update gave the M26 chassis some improvements, including a more powerful engine, which, although it didn't solve the mobility problem, allowed for better operational effectiveness. During the war, this new version of the M26 Pershing would then be known as the M46 Patton, a tribute to the legendary American general. So did you like our content? If you want Sala de Guerra to keep producing these videos, consider supporting us. You can help us by sending us a Pix or through our campaign on Apoya-C. There, you'll get access to our exclusive WhatsApp group and have your name displayed here in the videos. The link is right here in the description. Well, if you like this video, don't forget to share it with your friends as well. Give us a thumbs up and subscribe to Sala de Guerra so you don't miss anything else. I'll stop here for now. Thank you again for watching, and here's a big hug from Sala de Guerra.